Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week is an interesting opinion article on the challenge trial where 34 individuals volunteered to be infected with COVID-19. A study looking at twins who grew up in separate countries. A possible explanation as to why the pig heart to human heart transplant may have failed. The record-breaking weight loss drug that's currently being trialled, and the unusual and somewhat inexplicable fascination researchers have with taking bodily fluids from one group of mice and injecting it into much older mice. These news items and others can be found at the timestamps given below. Let's start with the opinion article coming out of Bloomberg. It's a interesting read, primarily because it looks at the experiences and perception of one of the individuals who took part in that trial. The idea behind it was, get 34 individuals, give them a dose of COVID, and see how much it takes to infect them and what symptoms they experience in a controlled environment. If they don't get infected the first time, increase the dose until you figure out just how much is needed. For these particular people, 18 of them were infected with the smallest dose. The remainder had to have increased doses to be able to get infected. They all began exhibiting symptoms very early on, within 2 days. From here on, the article explores the experiences of the individual and why they took part. It also explains that some of the events we were seeing way back at the beginning of COVID are things that we're still looking at now. For example, nausea, the loss of sense of smell. Going from challenge trials to what is effectively a twin-controlled trial, one of the most highest standards you can possibly achieve, and in many cases, is impossible to achieve. In this case, it was the study of identical twins, that is, twins from the same egg that split, and trying to figure out whether or not their IQ differences were due to environment or genetics. They found that there was a 16-point difference in IQ between the two based on being in different environments. The two twins come from South Korea. One of them was eventually sent to the US where they were adopted. The child from South Korea appears to have had a higher IQ than that from America, which again is interesting when you look at the different cultures and environments in which they were raised. This study would indicate that environment does have a significant impact on the IQ of children, separately to genetics, and this is the first time that they have been able to definitively demonstrate it with such a elaborate and, frankly, compelling case. Going now from a combination of psychology and genetics to pure medical news and further information on the recent genetically modified pig heart transplant that eventually led to a patient's death. It was a first of its kind, and theoretically, it was going to open the door for the option of allowing the development of organs in animals that would drastically reduce the need for human-to-human transplants. Unfortunately, not much after it took place, the patient died, and this was a big problem. This technology would have been a huge boon. Understanding what happened is really important. The patient was going to die regardless at this stage, and so the heart transplant was something of a last attempt to try and circumvent the problem. They were not eligible for an organ donation. This allowed them to live on, theoretically, and also paved the way for others. One of the important considerations when having anything like this, particularly when we're talking about something that's being transplanted, the organs and the animal as a whole are raised in an environment that should minimize any possible risk of contamination. This both means chemical and biological. When we're talking about biological, we're mostly thinking about viruses, and this is one of the possible reasons why the patient died. There are reports that the medical examination has found something called porcine cytomegalovirus. Unsurprisingly, a virus, but one that's normally transmitted amongst wild animals. how the pig, when it was raised in the facility designed to prevent any kind of contamination, had this infection is a problem. Admittedly, from what's been stated in the article, there was very little of the virus detected, and this is about 20 days after the transplant occurred, so it is possible that this may have occurred after the transplant, which means that there's even other considerations that it raises with regards to the viability of xenotransplants. Going from clinical news about organ transplants to clinical news about weight loss, and a new drug that's under development for weight loss. It's called tirzepatide, and it's by the American pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly. The once-a-week injection is intended to mimic hormones in the human body. These are hormones that should lower blood glucose levels and help to moderate metabolic processes. This means not only do you feel full, but you also have reductions in the amount of sugar that's in your blood circulating around the body, thereby increasing weight. The hormone it's meant to be mimicking to some extent are called incretins. The clinical trial is currently trying to figure out things like dosing, side effects, and so on. All the usual hallmarks of a phase 3 clinical trial. Phase 3 basically being what happens shortly before the largest and most extensive of trials occur. The trial ran over 72 weeks and had a little over 2,500 participants. They were either overweight or obese, but they could not have diabetes, which was an important caveat for this. They were given 5, 10 or 15 milligrams each week. All three groups saw weight loss that was worth noting. Admittedly, it does appear that there was an association between the amount of the drug given and the amount of weight loss. Admittedly, the difference between the 15 and 10 milligram dose group is significantly less, approximately 1%, versus between the 10 and 5 milligram group, which is about 5.5%. Even looking at the difference between the 5 milligram group, who lost 16% of their body weight, and the placebo group, who only lost 2.4% of their body weight, it's a really big difference. And this means the drug does work, and there's an average of 20% weight loss across all of the participants. It's also worth noting that this is an American trial, and as you can imagine, being based in America, there is a very good chance that it will follow most other traps that America falls into when it comes to healthcare.
My fellow Americans, many of you have concerns about healthcare. I've never been sick or injured. My blood is incredibly strong and pure. So I will be donating a pint of blood a week to the uninsured. Just a little bit of my blood and your immune system will be indestructible.
The most obvious for most people is the exorbitant cost of healthcare. The worry here is that this is very similar to another drug currently available by the Danish company called Novo Nordisk. It's made by them because it involves some of the drugs that they're most familiar with for treating diabetes. If it was sold in the US and is a similar cost to what is sold in Denmark, there is a good chance that you're looking at somewhere in the range of $1,300 or more per month for weight loss. No gym membership is going to set you back that much. At the same time, this may be covered by some health insurance. So you can see how this gets very messy very quickly, and there are very few alternatives for some people. Going from drugs that you inject into your body to the weird fascination that researchers have of injecting things into mice and rats. In this case, feces. The fundamental basis of this research was to take feces from young mice and put it into old mice. It just sounds like something distorted and weird, but it's true. Fecal transplants are not unheard of. There is research in various areas indicating that it may or may not be effective for certain disorders. The jury is still well and truly out on its efficacy. The few places it has been shown to have some effect include things like allergies to things like gluten, peanuts, and so on. There are also other areas where it's being pursued, such as treating neurological conditions. This looked at the effect of fecal transplants on aging, the eyes, and brain. Only one of these makes much in the way of sense to us based on what we know already. What goes on in the gut does seem to have some effect on the brain, and that appears to be partially related to how the immune system is trained and looked after from what's in your gut. What the researchers were looking at was whether or not that same training of the immune system helps not only modulate things like inflammation with the brain, but also retinas. By looking after your retina, you then look after the eye it's part of. This means in theory that the fecal transplant should have some effect and benefit that way. As with most parts of the human body, as you get older, your GI tract doesn't perform as well. One of the reasons for this is simply wear and tear. As you get older, motility wears out, things don't work the way they should, and bacteria build up in ways that are unexpected. This then changes how your immune system works, which, given you're older, also performs less well. Altering the microbes within your GI tract may give your immune system a bit of a pick-me-up, and thereby help to try and get it back on the right track. According to the researchers, all of the indicators that they were looking at indicated beforehand that there was an increase in signs of aging in their mice before the transplant, and then there was a significant reduction after the transplant. Going from the interesting idea of injecting poo into other mice, we now have brain fluids. This week really does have the strangest of things. The idea here is, much like with the GI tract, to try and, at least artificially, make the mice younger. We wonder if perhaps the researchers have been reading too much into Elizabeth Bathory, a 16th and 17th century noble who bathed in the blood of virgins. In this case, they are at least basing their research on something a little more solid than past research into the idea of rejuvenating blood. What they've done is take cerebrospinal fluid, and they've also been able to show results and give a mechanism for how it works. That's the trifecta of things you need. You need to have not only cause and effect, but you need to be able to explain that cause and effect. Without that last part, you'll never get this approved as a treatment. While the testing in question does seem somewhat crude, it is at least able to show something. What they found was that by training the animals to respond to the stimuli of flashing lights and being shocked, and then giving the CSF or a CSF-type placebo, they were then able to test whether or not they responded in the same way when given the young CSF fluid. Those that did receive it tended to have better responses. Admittedly, this isn't ideal, as you're not actually looking at what happens inside the brain and seeing if perhaps they were able to develop or repair damage that had occurred. Instead, the researchers jumped straight to the genetic testing step and are hoping to be able to explain what happens that way. What they found was that the CSF that was transplanted had an effect on oligodendrocytes. These are cells involved in myelination of neurons, and myelin helps to ensure that signals sent along the axon get to where it's meant to go in the end with maximum strength of that signal. It also is able to travel faster and get less interference from other neurons. Upregulating the activity of these cells may help with memory retention, or it could just be a coincidental discovery. Going from clinical type news to kind of weird news, the use of an algae type tank to power a computer for 6 months. This is really bizarre, but it makes sense in some respect. Most organisms have some sort of electrical charge to them. For example, our own neurons have to shift voltages in order to send signals down the axon. Algae aren't so different. In many respects, this setup is far more practical than other examples from recent weeks. The advantages to this are that it really only requires sunlight, a sealed container, and some sort of nutrient. That's enough to get it started and keep it running. Everything after that is largely self-contained. When the sun is out, it was able to produce 4 microwatts per square centimeter. This is also the equivalent of 1 gram of water or 1 milliliter of water. When the sun went away, it was able to use food reserves within the nutrient solution that is in the same container to also generate power. Admittedly, this is all in a system the size of an AA battery. So, incredibly tiny, but also very potent for what it is. Where this research gets interesting is that it was able to run a small 32-bit processor for about 45 minutes in every hour. This was done for over 6 months in ambient light of a laboratory. That means we're not talking something like full sunlight or anything else that's going to really give it some power, but just everyday, easily accessible situations. If you were to deploy this in the field, for instance, in remote monitoring stations, it would have considerably more power behind it and be able to run largely indefinitely, or at least until the nutrient solutions ran out. The last piece of Earth-related news is animal news, and it's further bad news for New Jersey. Other than the fact that it's Jersey, they found a nearly 500 kilogram shark in the waters nearby. Yeah, again, it's Jersey, what do you expect? The over 400 kilogram shark is about 3.7 meters, or 12.4 feet and 1,000 pounds. It's somewhat migratory and has now come back to New Jersey after going through the mating season.
But I won't let you have the satisfaction of catching me. I'm escaping to the one place that hasn't been corrupted by capitalism.
To Mars, we have yet more weird images from people who have way too much time on their hands. It's what looks like a door observed by the Curiosity rover. Yes, it looks like a door, but it is just a rock. Through the power of optical illusions and geology, people are able to figure out the likely cause and effect behind this and why what we're seeing is just a fracture in the rock which, after we see it from where we're seeing it through the rover, appears to be a door. This is all the more likely given the number of quakes that have occurred on Mars recently. Next is the first of the images that we can really start to appreciate from the James Webb Telescope. The James Webb Space Telescope has been put up in lieu of a Hubble telescope, although it will continue to function for some time. It is a much larger, much more complicated, and much more modern piece of equipment. In theory, this should open the door to many, many better ways to investigate our universe, or at least parts thereof. The first of the images we're starting to get through now show just how much difference there is in the resolution between the Webb telescope and prior telescopes. What Hubble's able to see now is about 100 times less than what the James Webb Telescope will be able to see, or at least, that's what the predictions hold, and we're waiting to see just what those images are like. Our final piece of news for this week is both something, well, weird as many of the other items have been, but also bizarre in terms of just what it is. It's a massive black hole flipping its magnetic field. That may come across as an odd thing to describe, but by itself, a black hole shouldn't have a magnetic field, but because it's surrounded by that dense plasma cloud, it does begin to form a magnetic field. This is generated by the plasma cloud going around it, generating electricity, which then causes magnetism. That magnetism, if we're to follow most normal things as you see them on Earth, should be more or less fixed. Except, as we know from Earth itself, it doesn't always stay fixed. Occasionally, the poles will flip. Establishing this for Earth is hard enough, and trying to figure out with it happening to a black hole is even harder. It relies heavily on proxy means of detecting it, largely looking at X-rays that are coming out of the black hole. What they believe has happened is that there has been a change in the nature of that accretion disk around the black hole that led to a change in the way it heats up, and this then affected things like visible light, ultraviolet light, and X-rays. These in combination led them to believe that it was in fact a change in direction of magnetism. This is also currently the leading theory, admittedly because it's also the first time that they've seen this phenomena, so you can only take your best guess as to what's happening based on the available evidence. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below